Now, where do you think he fits in the pantheon of great mob lawyers?
He's up there, but he just had too many vices. His gambling and his lifestyle, how he got too close. It got in the way of his career. He would have been one of the greats if he hadn't gotten so close and had just taken control of his lifestyle a little bit.
The legends of America's mobs are woven into the fabric of society and pop culture. We've all seen the movies or heard the tales of these criminal organizations. Their stories of power, wealth, respect, family, greed, betrayal, violence, murder, and mayhem. While the golden age of the mobs may be over, organized crime continues to thrive, and the stories remain as infamous as ever. You're listening to the Gangland History Podcast, hosted by mob historian Jacob Stoops. He tells the true crime biographies of real-life mobsters and dives deep into the plots, subplots, and real facts behind organized crime in America. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Gangland History Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Stoops, mob historian, podcast enthusiast, and we're here with another lawyer-centric episode with our subject matter expert and friend of the show, Mr. Tony Taouk from Down Under. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you, Jacob. Good to be back.
Glad to have you back. Got a lot of really good responses from the Reis episode. People enjoyed George Reis, and I enjoyed covering him as well. And I enjoyed digging into his background, or not just his background, but also his propensity to talk about himself in the third person. And I've taken a lot, probably more joy than I should have in responding to comments in the third person as Reis. But I don't know. That's just something that has been fun for me to do. But why don't we go ahead and we're going to jump right in. Today's episode is on Philadelphia legend Robert Bobby Simone. If you don't know who he is, he comes up quite a lot. He does have an autobiography called The Last Mouthpiece, The Man Who Dared to Defend the Mob. But also he comes up quite a lot in the book Mafia Prince, which is written by Phil Leonetti, the former underboss of the Bruno Scarfo family, and written also by Scott Bernstein. Really good book. Bobby is sprinkled throughout. And Bobby was a really amazing attorney. And Tony, as our subject matter expert, we're gonna kind of dig in. But the one thing that I'll say that stood out to me from his book summary, and I'm just going to quote it: during the 1960s and 70s, if you were in Philadelphia and in trouble with the law, the word on the street was all you have to do is hire Bobby Simone and you will win. And win he did. So why don't we get into it? Let's just jump right in. So, Bobby represented a lot of really important guys from the Philadelphia mob. He would represent Scarfo, Frank the Baracuda Sindone, Philip Crazy Phil Leonetti, Lawrence Yogi Merlino, the Union leader John McCullough, who was ultimately murdered by the Philadelphia mob. Where is he from and how did he become known?
He was born in Philadelphia in 1933. He studied law at Temple University and he was admitted to the Pennsylvania bar in 1959. He started his legal career mainly doing civil cases, but he was thrust onto the tabloids when he began representing a colourful showgirl called Lillian Reis in 1961. Now, Reis and her mobster boyfriend were charged with the theft of about $500,000 worth of cash and jewelry from the Pottsville, Pennsylvania home of a wealthy coal baron called John Rich. Apparently, Reis tipped off the thieves about the cash and jewelry in the safe he had at his house. Now, Reis's original trial ended with a hung jury, When the time came for a second trial, she'd run out of money, so she could only afford a rookie lawyer. And that's when Robert Simone comes in. He was 28 years old, very little experience. Apparently, he'd only been doing civil cases like motor vehicle stuff at this point. But Reis knew him well because they hung out at a downtown Philadelphia nightclub called the Celebrity Room. And for some unknown reason, she was prepared to risk it. She was found guilty at her second trial. However, Simone successfully appealed the trial on the basis that the court had permitted her silence to be used against her in violation of her Fifth Amendment right to remain silent.
I was in her nightclub one night, and she asked me if I would represent her in the upcoming retrial of the case. And I explained to her that I really am not a criminal lawyer. She said, Bobby, I trust you, and I know you're a good lawyer, and I know you can handle this. I knew how high profile the case was, so if she was willing to gamble with me, I was willing to gamble with her.
The police read these statements of these two informants, and these guys implicated her in the crime. She didn't make any statement. She just refused to answer the question. She exercised her Fifth Amendment right. And at that time, those kind of silent sequences were admissible as an admission of guilt.
Now, it was a highly publicised appeal that went on for years, and Simone's name was constantly appearing in the newspapers and attracting a lot of new clientele that included mobsters. So that's how he kind of got his start.
So it's funny that that you mentioned Lillian Reis. So she's kind of a legend in Philadelphia, and she is probably better known as Tiger Lil, Lil Reis, and her boyfriend was none other than Ralph Jr. Stano, who was also involved in that Pottsville case. And I'm doing an episode where I cover mob hits in the 1960s. It's probably going to come out before this, while I'm waiting on some Bruno paperwork. And in that Pottsville case, which, if you think about it, I think the robbery ended up being $475,000 in 1961 money, which translates to several million. So that was a big, big score that she was kind of the point person on. And not only that, she was attached to the case with a couple of other guys. In addition to Junior Stano, there were two other guys named Vincent and Richie Blaney that had some roundabout involvement, and they were both murdered. And that's something that we're going to talk about in the hits episode, brutally murdered. So that's just an interesting bit of color with his start. But let's get back to Bobby Simone. He had a bit of a debaucherous lifestyle, which tended to expose him to the underworld often. And did it generate more work for him?
Well, he frequented bars and nightclubs that were crowded with mobsters and other criminals, as you'd expect. And he was a heavy gambler, a heavy drinker, and a compulsive. Well, he was a philanderer, a heavy drinker, and a compulsive gambler. As you'd expect, compulsive gamblers always need to borrow money to chase their losses. And before you knew it, he was borrowing money from a guy called Frank Sindone, a loan shark who happened to be a senior figure in the Philadelphia mob. So when Sindone was charged with loan sharking, naturally he turned to his valued customer for legal assistance. He was charged for, it involved an insurance broker who was late in his payments. Sindone allegedly threatened him with physical harm over the phone. And during the phone call, which happened to be intercepted by the FBI, he referred to a baseball bat and an axe. When the police went to Sindone's home to arrest him, they said that they found a baseball bat and an axe in the backseat of his car, which they said proved that Sindone intended to make good on the threats he made to that insurance broker over the phone. Now, during cross-examination, Simone asked the FBI agent how many photographs he had taken at Sindone's residence. The agent said he took 75 to 100 photos. He then asked the agent to show him a picture of the bat and the axe he refers to in the statements. The agent responded, "I don't have them. They were never taken."
So on cross-examination, I asked the agent, show the jury the bat and the axe.
And the agent says, well, we don't have it. We didn't confiscate it. So Bobby kind of raises an eyebrow to the jury. Then he says, you guys were taking pictures that day. He said, yeah, we took dozens of pictures. Show the jury a picture of the bat and the axe. Well, we don't have a picture of it.
And I grabbed 100 and some pictures, and I said, you mean you took all these pictures, you didn't take that one picture, and you recognize that's a critical part of your case? The agent had no answer.
The agent was just completely discredited, and the jury acquitted Sindone. And that's when Sindone's name started circulating in the Philadelphia underworld as a effective lawyer, and he was on his way after that.
Among the people that were coming in with these criminal cases were certain guys. They were considered by the press and by the government to be organized crime.
It's only a matter of time before Simone comes to the attention of the most powerful men in Philly. Angelo Bruno, the boss of the Philadelphia Mafia, and his number 2 man, Phil Chicken Man Testa.
I met Angelo Bruno with Phil Testa in a bar in South Philadelphia called the Friendly Bar. They walked in and introduced themselves to me after the owner of the bar told them that I had just won a case for the bartender. They were gentlemen.
You're supposed to be the reputed head of the mob in Philadelphia.
That's BS.
And so Sindone was a pretty big fish at that point in time, and Sindone himself would ultimately be murdered for his role in the down-the-line plots against the various bosses who themselves were murdered, that being Angelo Bruno and Phil Testa. So I believe he was murdered, if I remember my history right, under Scarfo. And speaking of Scarfo, Bobby Simone and Scarfo, little Nicky Scarfo, eventually get hooked up. So how did he end up representing Scarfo?
Well, Scarfo wasn't exactly a businessman. He was purely a gangster, and it didn't take much to get in his bad side, which wasn't a good idea because he resorted to violence and murder in the first instance. Now, Scarfo, together with his nephew, Phil Leonetti, set up a cement contracting business in Atlantic City called Scarf Inc. Scarfo set up Scarf Inc. to take advantage of the legalization of gambling in Atlantic City in the 1970s. He used this close association with the leaders of Local 54, that's the Hotel and Restaurant Employees Union, to obtain cement contracts for casinos being built in Atlantic City. Scarf Inc. poured concrete for foundations of several Atlantic City casinos, including Trump Plaza. Now, in 1979, one of his competitors, an Atlantic City cement contractor called Vincent Falcone, apparently made negative comments about Scarf Inc. and suggested that their work was substandard or something to that effect. In response, Scarfo and some of his men invited Falcone to a house in Margate, New Jersey to have some drinks. One of the men that was also invited was a plumber who hobnobbed around mobsters but wasn't a mobster himself. His name was Joseph Salerno. Now, Falcone was shot in the back of the head while he was preparing some drinks in the kitchen. Joseph Salerno, that plumber we were talking about, was horrified at what he saw because he wasn't a mobster. He was just an ordinary guy who liked to hang around with mobsters. He went straight to the authorities. He was horrified. I still can't figure out why they would commit a murder while an outsider's there. But then again, Scarfo wasn't exactly known for his mental muscle.
So if you read anything about that case, Salerno in particular, as you said, was a civilian. So there's really no reason to have brought him there. However, if you read the book Mafia Prince, as I said, which is a firsthand account from the person who actually shot Vincent Falcone, Phil Leonetti himself, they brought Salerno there to throw off Falcone's scent because Falcone himself was a semi-mobster. Him and Leonetti were supposedly friends. And of course, Scarfo ordered Leonetti essentially to kill his friend. And there's kind of a famous story after the killing that Scarfo gets completely plastered drunk. One of the only times Leonetti ever saw him drunk. And they have Salerno actually help with the removal of the body, and Scarfo is just sitting there basking in the glory. He called Falcone the big shot, and he's just basking in the glory of this particular killing. And I think he said something to the effect of, "I love this stuff. God, I love it." which just goes to show kind of what a big psychopath that he was. And I believe that this was the actual case where the authorities pretty much had Scarfo, Leonetti, Merlino pretty much dead to rights. Am I right?
That's right. They were all charged with murder. And in that trial, Simone was retained to act as lead counsel. And as you'd expect, Joseph Salerno was the witness for the prosecution.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as an eyewitness to the murder, Simone had to discredit Salerno if his clients had any hope of getting off. But it wasn't long before he found the chink in the armour. During cross-examination, Simone revealed that Salerno owed a lot of people money and was virtually bankrupt. He even admitted that he owed money to the murder victim, Vincent Falcone. So this was damaging to the prosecution case for two reasons. Firstly, he implied that Salerno went into the witness protection program to avoid paying his debts. Secondly, it gave him a motive to kill Vincent Falcone and then blame it on someone else, namely Scarfo and his henchmen, who were known to be violent criminals, so they were easy targets for law enforcement. On top of this, Salerno admitted to helping Scarfo, as you said, put the victim's body into the trunk of the car where it was later found. Simone emphasised the coroner's findings that the bullet, after it entered the victim's head, took a downward trajectory. The purpose of bringing this out and emphasising it in front of the jury was to suggest that Salerno, who was much taller than the defendants and Falcone, must have been the one who fired the gun. Simone also managed to blow large holes in Salerno's testimony. Around the time of the murder, Scarfo and his men got around in a big black Cadillac. Now, Salerno had testified that the big black Cadillac was parked next to the Margate house at the time of Falcone's murder. A Margate police officer testified that he was patrolling the area around the time Salerno said the murder had occurred and didn't see the parked Cadillac. To drive this point home, Simone made sure that his clients arrived at the courthouse every morning in the same big black Cadillac to emphasise to the jurors that it was impossible not to notice such a big car. Scarfo and his men were acquitted in a stunning victory.
Yeah, and that's where you get the famous quote, the famous news clip from Scarfo, where he walks out of the courtroom and he says, "Thank God for the American jury system and honest jury," because they literally, and they knew it. It was a surprise to them that they were let off. They knew that they had really got one over because they were pretty much caught red-handed.
Thank God for the American jury system, an honest jury.
The murder of Vince Falcone earned Uncle Nicky's respect and bought Philip.
And one of the things, and Simone was really instrumental to their acquittal. And not only that, one of the things that I came across is a later interview from Simone talking about his relationship with Scarfo, who he considered to be a personal friend. And I'm just going to directly quote the interview that I saw. When I had and this is Simone speaking about Scarfo. When I had problems, he was one of the people who stood behind me. I consider him a loyal friend to have. So Simone was not afraid to be friends with complete and utter psychopaths. And from that point on, he was pretty much known as the guy to go to in Philadelphia if you had a case, especially if you were a part of the Philly mob. Now, why was Simone ultimately targeted by law enforcement?
Well, after the murder of Angelo Bruno in 1980 and the murder of Phil Tester in 1981, there was a bit of a power vacuum in the Philadelphia mob, which saw Nicky Scarfo rise to the top. Scarfo's managerial style differed significantly from his predecessors. They preferred to keep a low profile and go about their business. Scarfo's preferred management tool was intimidation, violence, and murder. Shortly after his ascent, he engaged in a murderous mob war with a faction within the Philadelphia mob headed by Harry Riccobene. He then decided to impose a mob tax on drug dealers in the city. Anyone who failed or refused to pay the tax was immediately sentenced to death. Now, as the bodies were piling up, Scarfo became a full-time target of law enforcement. Simone defended Scarfo during this tumultuous period and was constantly by his side, not only as his lawyer, but also as his friend and associate, as you said. Law enforcement was constantly seeing Simone turn up in surveillance footage, socialising, drinking, gambling and holidaying with Scarfo and his cronies. They formed the view that Scarfo was more than just a lawyer for these guys, and in 1984, they decided to indict Simone for tax evasion on the grounds that he failed to disclose assets to the IRS and had avoided payment of nearly $1 million in taxes. Simone, strangely, decided to represent himself at the trial and accused the government of targeting him and invading his privacy because of his successful representation of people with unsavoury reputations, which was kind of true. That's why they targeted him. And during the trial, and this was quite bizarre, but it worked, he produced a small tape recorder and he played Rockwell's then popular song called Somebody's Watching Me to the jury to emphasise how he felt about the government constantly pursuing him because of his association with notorious clients. He explained to the jury that he was a compulsive gambler who simply couldn't afford to pay his debts, especially when violent loan sharks were chasing him for unpaid debts. The jury was out for only 20 minutes and they returned a verdict of not guilty.
And one really funny quote that came from Simone after the trial was he would say, "Who was I supposed to pay, the IRS or the loan sharks? The interest is about the same. The health aspect is a little different." And it's funny. I guess if you're Bobby Simone, I guess the best person to represent you is Bobby Simone.
I'm annoyed that this case was brought because it would not have been brought against any other lawyer than me.
And it worked out in his credit this time. It wouldn't always work out, but it did work out in his favor this time.
Yeah, but lawyers are told never to represent themselves because they're too emotionally involved in a case and it affects their judgment.
Right.
Yes.
It's the ultimate conflict of interest.
That's right.
Now, when it came to discrediting informants, there was nobody better than Bobby Simone, right?
That's right. Now, as I said, Simone was constantly at Scarfo's side when he was subjected to an avalanche of indictments in the 1980s. Scarfo was indicted for ordering the murder of Philadelphia mobster Salvatore Testa. Scarfo perceived Testa as a threat to his leadership, and in keeping with his brutal leadership style, he decided to get rid of him. One of the men involved in the murder of Testa was a small-time crook-turned-mobster called Nick the Crow Caramandi. Caramandi was charged with extortion and turned government witness shortly thereafter. He was the chief witness in the Testa murder trial. Testa's body had been bound with rope, wrapped in a blanket and dumped beside a road in New Jersey. Now, when you have a person who participates in a murder testify, your client is in serious trouble. But then you got someone like Bobby Simone. When he was cross-examining a witness, Simone had a natural gift of knowing what to ask and when to stop asking. As one prosecutor put it, his questions were like surgical strikes, in and out. As you'd expect, a witness who testifies in a mob trial isn't exactly a choir boy or a model citizen. He usually has an extensive criminal history, and it's often as bad, if not worse, than the person who's on trial. And defence lawyers like Simone sees on this. Defence lawyers focus on the witness's criminal credentials and suggest that they're making up the stories in order to get a reduced sentence or some other incentive. Simone was excellent at dragging informants through the mud. At one trial, Simone had Caramandi recall his long career as a criminal and suggested that he had violated every law and broken every commandment known to God. Another tactic Simone used was to blast holes in the witness testimony by highlighting contradictions or errors in their version of events. The idea is if they're lying about one small detail, they could be lying about anything, so they just can't be taken at their word. If a witness is caught lying under oath, the jury is justified in disregarding their whole testimony. So the key is to get them with the small details. For example, Caramandi claimed to have made a phone call from a certain phone booth in front of a cigar store in Philadelphia. However, Simone was able to refute this by showing that the phone booth had been removed at least 5 years before the murder. Caramandi also testified that the rope used to tie Salvatore Testa's body was brought from a specific hardware store in Philadelphia, but Simone brought out the fact that the hardware store never sold that kind of rope. Things like this really damaged Caramandi's credibility in front of the jury, and ultimately Scarfo was acquitted of Testa's murder against the odds.
Yeah, and it is it's really interesting. There's the angle of Salvi Testa being incredibly popular and that being a very unpopular murder that I think was probably the apex point in the Scarfo era where things really started to slide downhill. And then you had a lot of people like Nick the Crow, Caramandi jump off board, Tommy Del Giorno, and many other informants would follow. So I don't think to discredit Nick the Crow by itself was probably very challenging. There are a lot of cases where, just like you said, the actual informants in cases sometimes are getting paid by the FBI or by law enforcement, and in many cases have a lot of reasons. Number one amongst them is to get off from their own crimes, to break free of those, or not be murdered, but have a lot of reasons to want to tailor their testimony a certain way. So it is interesting because Scarfo definitely, I think history shows Scarfo was definitely the driving force behind that murder. But that just does go to show how good of an attorney Bobby Simone was, because it wasn't just Nick the Crow. Nick the Crow was an easy one to discredit, but it was other informants as well. And he was just a master, like you said, of finding those little details and using them to trip up a witness in front of the jury and create that sense of doubt. And it kind of reminds me of a story that I was listening to a podcast today, and I heard something related to the assassination of Paul Castellano and a little hole in the story of Sammy Gravano, right? So this is very, very similar. And Gravano at some point said that they met at the house of Joe Watts, and Anthony Cardinale, who was being interviewed by this podcast, said in his cross-examination, he said, well, what did Joe Watts' house look like? What was inside of it? And the answer that Gravano gave was completely wrong. Now, in that case, it didn't work because John Gotti, who was on trial, ultimately was convicted. But it just goes to show that tactics like that are used to create doubt. And Simone was a master at doing that. And after that, he eventually successfully defended Scarfo against drug charges. Is that right as well?
Yeah, that's right. In the late 1980s, Scarfo and other mobsters, including Philip Leonetti and Salvatore Merlino, were indicted for allegedly running a drug ring involved in the distribution of methamphetamines. The government alleged that they were involved in the importation of P2P from Europe. Now, P2P is a key ingredient in the manufacture of methamphetamine and speed. Now, in this trial, Simone accused the prosecution of trying to prejudice the jury by repeatedly alluding to Scarfo's reputation as a violent mobster and relying on the testimony of admitted murderers and perjurers. Scarfo was ultimately acquitted on a technicality. Their activities amounted to extortion but not drug dealing. They were extorting money from people who were dealing drugs, which was extortion, but they weren't actually trafficking and distributing drugs as alleged in the indictment. But it was a hollow victory because ultimately Scarfo was convicted of multiple charges, including conspiracy, racketeering, and first-degree murder, and he died in prison in 2017.
All right. So Scarfo is acquitted of the drug charges, but ultimately has superseding charges, like you said, for murder, racketeering, pretty much enough to put him away for life. And it was really at this point, I believe that aligned to the time frame when Leonetti flipped, Lawrence Yogi Merlino flipped, kind of his upper echelon guys. Salvatore Chucky Merlino, the father of Joey Merlino, was I believe at that point in time away in prison. He was one of Scarfo's closest friends, so not there to help out or really take over the reins, and they had a falling out by that point in time. Now, Bobby Simone ultimately goes on, and speaking of the P2P connection. That P2P connection would have been from one Raymond Long John Martorano, who was the biggest drug dealer in Philadelphia and one of the biggest drug dealers in the country for decades. And at a certain point, Bobby Simone represented Long John's son, George Martorano, but Long John was actually not that impressed with Bobby Simone, which I actually find hard to believe. So I'm sure that that's an incredible story. What actually happened there?
Yeah, in 1982, George Martorano, who was the son of Long John Martorano, was charged with drug possession and conspiracy charges. Now, Simone advised George Martorano that if he entered a plea of guilty, he would likely spend about a decade in prison. Instead, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, and that came as a big shock. Now, the presiding judge at the trial was a judge called Judge Hannum. He had given a character testimony on Simone's behalf in his 1984 tax evasion trial, and this was heavily criticised in the media as highly unusual for a judge. Simone was seen in many circles at that time, not only as a mob lawyer, but as a mob functionary of sorts. So testifying to his good character is not a good career move for a judge, obviously. The Martoranos were convinced that Simone sold George down the river in exchange for Judge Hannum's character testimony in his tax trial. It's also been speculated that Judge Hannum may have imposed a harsh sentence on George Martorano to rehabilitate the damage caused to his reputation by appearing as a character witness for Simone. Long John Martorano was extremely displeased with Simone's representation of his son, to the point where Simone feared that Martorano would seek retribution upon his release from prison. Apparently, Simone communicated these concerns to Scarfo, and typically Scarfo just said to him, look, if he comes out of prison, I'll kill him straight away.
That's funny. Usually you would think, and this is all occurring before Scarfo ultimately goes away, and you would think that based on what had happened here, that other mobsters would be reticent to sign up for Bobby Simone, especially after you see somebody that expects a short sentence go away for life. And I think that the Martoranos had every right to probably be a little bit upset. That does sound misleading. And I would have been a little worried if I were Bobby Simone as well. And quite frankly, I wouldn't have been worried about the Martoranos. I would have been worried about Scarfo going off the deep end, as he was prone to do. So that just, again, it's just another thing that tells you how valuable Simone was to Scarfo, in that normally Scarfo would have just killed him and left him in the street. And he chose not to defend his guys in the family, the Martoranos, and to stick with Simone. So that does say something about Bobby. Now, at some point, Bobby does get in trouble, and Bobby does go to prison. Now, the government alleges Simone was involved in a mob shakedown scheme. Can you tell us about that?
The government had formed the view that Simone had well and truly crossed the line in his association with the Philadelphia mob, and decided to treat him as an actual member of the criminal enterprise. In 1991, Simone was indicted for a few charges, which included conspiracy to violate RICO and conspiracy to interfere with commerce by extortion. The federal government alleged, among other things, that Simone was involved in a scheme by the Philadelphia mob to shake down a Philadelphia developer for $1 million, and they indicted him for racketeering and extortion, as I said. The government alleged that Simone was supposed to get 10% of the proceeds of the $1 million extortion. Unfortunately for Simone, Scarfo's nephew and protege, Phil Leonetti, had become a government witness by this stage, and he testified that Simone was aware of and involved in the extortion scheme. In 1992, he was convicted of racketeering and extortion and served nearly 3 years in federal.
He said that I knew about the thing, which I did know about, but he went further and said that I was supposed to get 10% of it.
Be careful, that's what he said. But think of me at the same time. Be careful, but think of me. Make sure I get a piece of this thing.
And this was certainly a case of flying too close to the sun, where the line was probably crossed. And it's definitely interesting. He kind of became what he had defended, and he paid a price. And how long again did he go to prison for?
He served 3 years in federal prison. He was also disbarred as a lawyer.
Disbarred, yeah.
He managed to get his law license restored after he was released from prison, but he became ill and died in 2007. To his dying day, he accused the government of targeting him due to his effectiveness as a defence attorney and his representation of unpopular clients like Nicky Scarfo.
One of the jurors was asked, "What was the basis of your conviction?" And this woman said, "Well, the government proved he was a mob lawyer, that he represented all those mobsters," which shows how dangerous it is to be tagged with that term.
He wrote this memoir that you referred to, The Last Mouthpiece. After he left prison, he really criticises the government in it for using informants, and he says things like that the government frees more dangerous criminals than the defence lawyers do, and they make sweetheart deals with inappropriate sweetheart deals with violent criminals all the time, and that the government is corrupt. And yeah, it's quite a sad tale what happened to him. But like you said, he got too close.
It's not. Well, he's not wrong on all accords, but that doesn't change the fact that he made his career and he made his bones on representing, mobsters who, in almost every case, were murderers and people that were certainly hurting people in the community. So I guess it's just one of those things where you are. It's like I tell my kids, you sometimes are who you're associated with, right? You got to choose your friends wisely, and he chose his friends, and for the most part, it seemed to benefit him. It served him well until it didn't. And I'm actually surprised that he only went away for 3 years, especially with those associations. It's surprising that he didn't go away for longer. Now, in his obituary, so I want to put a bow on this. In his obituary, in the Philadelphia Inquirer, which was written by Philadelphia mob guru George Anastasia quoted a lot of friends of Bobby Simone, a lot of fellow attorneys, and I just want to read a couple of those because it does speak to his level of quality as an attorney. So the first one, he was the last of the big city, big time, hard hitting criminal lawyers, and that's Edwin Jacobs Jr. When he was on top of his game, there was nobody better. He was a combination of instinct, charm, and legal talent. That was another defense lawyer named Donald Mano. Let me see. I want to quote another one. One more. Louis Pacini said he was one of the best trial lawyers I ever went up against. And last thing by a man named Robert Madden, a former federal prosecutor who called Simone a legend, a great lawyer. He was a man of his word. If he told you something, you could bank on it. That's the way it was going to be. So let's put a bow on Bobby Simone. If you, again, we've talked about this idea of the Mount Rushmore of mob lawyers. Now, where do you think he fits in the pantheon of great mob lawyers?
He's up there, but he just had too many vices. His gambling and his lifestyle and how he got too close. It got in the way of his career. He would have been one of the greats if he hadn't gotten so close and had just taken control of his lifestyle a little bit.
Yeah, he seemed to love the life.
Yeah.
All right, so another episode in the books. Bobby Simone. We'll be doing more of these lawyer episodes in the future. I find them intriguing. A little bit of expertise from Tony in terms of deep diving who they were and bringing the perspective of being an attorney and talking about what is his area of expertise. Really talking about the tactics and the strategy behind some of these guys and who they represent. I didn't say this at the beginning of the show, but I'll just say it here. If you've enjoyed this content, please hit like, subscribe. I'm still working on 10,000 subscribers on YouTube. Again, if you're on the audio version, please go leave me a review, feedback on Apple Podcasts. And as I end every episode, and Tony, I'll let you say goodbye before I close. I almost forgot to let you close.
See you guys.
Yep. And as I end every episode, grazie.
Thank you for listening to the Gangland History Podcast. If you'd like to donate to the show, check out our Patreon channel. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit like and subscribe to help the channel grow. If you're an audio-only listener, subscribe via Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or anywhere you get your podcasts. Until next time, don't forget to keep your mouth shut.